to Civility, and take this opportunity to ask you to please silence your cell phones. We have a great program in store tonight, and I'm going to let Chris Bruhl with the Business Council introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much for welcoming us, and of course, thank you to the library for hosting. This Civility in America series has really brought a remarkable range of perspectives, viewpoints, and personalities to this room over the last number of years. And having just had a chance to spend roughly an hour with our speaker, I can tell you that the tradition has not only been upheld, it's been elevated. And so I'm delighted that you're all here to hear the thoughts of Joanne Lublin, who is, as the headline says in the materials inviting you to come, a veteran Wall Street Journal editor. I'm a veteran myself of a different kind of place of battle, but there's something else, the idea of insights, knowledge, understanding, experience, and the translation of life into wisdom and a point of view that really Ms. Lublin's career manifests that process. She has been the management news editor of the Wall Street Journal until recently retiring. She and a whole wide range of management issues, of course, were her purview. She really developed and led the career journal pages of the journal for decades. As an author, her most recent book is called Earning It, and it focuses on the career experiences of 52 highly successful senior women in American enterprises. She's a graduate of Northwestern University and of Stanford University, and really has had a remarkable career of interacting with the issues of enterprise in our society over a long period of time, and the people who drive enterprise, who affect enterprise. So the opportunity to hear your thoughts, her thoughts, on civility in the corporate world in a time in our society when civility perhaps is a concept under challenge. It's a special opportunity to hear from an observer and a doer and an activist. And let me get out of the way, therefore, and welcome Joanne Lublin to the podium.
I love it when people introduce me and say, and her latest book is Earning It, Hard-Won Lessons from Trailblazing Women at the Top of the Business World. It's also my only book. But I've only just begun. I do plan to write another book, and it's one of the reasons I chose to retire when I did. I want to tell you a little bit to get you to understand why I did this book. An essay that I wrote called Remember the Barriers is what prompted me to do this book. I wrote this essay for our then young adult daughter, and it appeared in 2008 in a Wall Street Journal blog that no longer exists. It was called Journal Women. And it talked about some of the uncivil experiences I had as a woman in the workplace in the early 1970s when I became a journalist. It stirred so much reaction that I wondered whether high-ranking executive women had faced similar career challenges due to their gender. As it turned out, nearly 2/3 of the 52 women I interviewed for Earning It are experienced public company CEOs. Women like Mary Barra, the CEO of General Motors, Ginny Rometty at IBM, Beth Mooney, who 7 years ago became the first female CEO of a major financial services institution at Key Corp, and here we are 7 years later, and she still is the only female CEO of a major financial services institution. And Mary Dillon, who is a two-time CEO, now running Ulta Salon. Many of these women described how overcoming career obstacles made them better leaders. And in many cases, they also had to deal with personal setbacks, and that became the overarching theme of the book. But all too often, these women, like me, faced obstacles involving incivility in the workplace. they found themselves repeatedly treated rudely, simply because they were women. And in fact, they often learned how not to lead because they worked for jerk bosses. Anne Mulcahy, the former CEO of Xerox and a Connecticut resident, one of those 52 women, had direct experience at Xerox working for a jerk boss. The problem is that incivility on the job hurts individuals' well-being and performance. Employees who are exposed to inconsiderate words and deeds lose productivity, creativity, and loyalty, some experts say. And in fact, according to one large-scale study, an estimated 48% of employees who were faced with incivility intentionally then decreased their work effort. 47% intentionally decreased their time at work, and 38% intentionally decreased the quality level of their work simply because of the incivility in the workplace. Workplace rudeness also feels like a threat, and it drains resources. And in fact, that could cause potentially devastating outcomes, in particular for hospital patients, one researcher warned. Ordinary people are understandably infuriated by such awful behaviors. But Brenda Barnes, the late CEO of Sara Lee Corporation, was no ordinary person. In her case, she, who was one of those women I interviewed for the book, took a very demeaning experience with incivility, and she made it into a powerful teaching moment for her top male managers. In the 1990s, she was the second highest executive at PepsiCo North America. She attended a company-sponsored dinner at a hotel in the Caribbean for some of their major customers. As the evening grew to a close, a drunk senior executive of a large grocery chain approached her. She told me, "This guy picked me up under the arms and he was holding me up in the air. My legs cleared the air." As you could imagine, this executive felt totally humiliated. "Put me down, please," she demanded. He laughed and kept her airborne. How's that for incivility? Suddenly, 6 men who worked for Brenda rushed to her defense. They formed a circle around their uplifted boss. "The guy who was holding me put me down," she told me, and her deputies escorted her out of the banquet hall. During her subsequent meetings with her male lieutenants, she cited this humiliating experience to reinforce a very powerful message, that they needed to treat their female employees with dignity, and they needed to intensify their efforts to mentor and to promote women. She said to them, "Play an active role in making it right. You can't take a back seat on this. This is not just a women's issue." In hindsight, she told me, a good leader creates a corporate culture that teaches people right and wrong behavior. In other words, a good leader teaches people how to practice civility. In 2005, when she became CEO of Sara Lee, it was the biggest Fortune 500 company at that time, led by a woman. Tragically, a serious stroke cut short her tenure 5 years later at the age of 56, and she died last year at the age of 63. Tonight, I want to share with you at greater depth insights from 3 other women I interviewed for the book who exhibited civility and practiced it by returning it. They all gave back to women who are keen to follow in their footsteps and move ahead in business. You're going to hear what it takes to be an effective sponsor, effective board member, and an effective supervisory opponent of sexual harassment in the workplace. And I'm going to share with you a relevant leadership lesson from each one of those women's experiences at Practicing Civility. And what I'm going to tell you about are 3 women who, by doing this, made it possible for other women to pursue corporate success. One of them is a woman we spoke about at this event I was just at, but you're going to hear more about her, Sammy Peterson. The second is Paula Rosput Reynolds, and the third is Dorit Byrne. Their extra efforts to assist women typified many of these women that I met while reporting my book. And their commitment refutes that popular myth that there's something called queen bees, women who refuse to help other women move ahead. In fact, one study concluded that a woman has a better chance at getting into senior management when a woman occupies the corner office than when a man does. And that study was based at looking at top management at S&P 1,500 companies over 20 years. On the other hand, women continue to experience incivility in other ways from other women, and in fact, more so than from male coworkers, according to a research that was recently described in the Harvard Business Review. The kind of incivility that these women encountered from other women included being put down in a condescending way and having derogatory comments directed toward them. Equally distressing, in my opinion, women who act more assertively at work were more likely to report getting uncivil treatment from other women. My first story is about practicing civility by promoting sponsorship, and that concerns Sammy Peterson. Today, Sandy is the highest-ranking woman at Johnson & Johnson, the health products giant whose products we all have in our medicine cabinet. But she takes that lofty status very, very seriously. She is the widowed mother of 2 sons who was brought to J&J in 2012, partly so she could help turn around its troubled consumer business unit. That unit's brands include things like Tylenol and many other products we use every day. She also oversees global manufacturing. But she, along with many other women who I met in preparing this book, believe in paying it forward by trying to guide and propel the careers of junior female associates. And that is a task that Sandy passionately committed herself to after she joined J&J. In June 2015, women made up about 31% of the company's vice presidents worldwide. And she said in talking to me for the book, we are going to make sure we have 50% women in leadership roles by the time we are all done. That is part of what I do because I want to have a positive impact on women's lives. So what's her game plan? What she does is she demands that her peers, other women at senior levels at J&J, champion lower level ones. And she says to these women, you need to actively sponsor other women to make them successful. Do not wait for the guys to do it. And in taking this stance, she stresses the fact for her own team that being a sponsor and learning how to sponsor others is a key aspect of what she's going to hold them accountable as team building. And she says, in turn, I'm going to hold you responsible for making sure the people that report to you encourage sponsorship. Sandy came of age like I did in a different era. She got hired as a management consultant in 1987 by McKinsey, the big management consulting firm. Some of her female peers at that time thought she was kind of weird because unlike virtually all of them in the office where she joined, she had a young child and they didn't. And so as a result, she said, women did not support each other. They pulled up the ladder. So what is the leadership lesson from how Sandy practices civility? If you can become a sponsor, if you can give lower level staffers frank feedback, then you need to do that as part of being a sponsor. Because speaking frankly, but empathetically, means that you will be respected. Sandy got this advice from one of her bosses at McKinsey because she was struggling over how to get some underperformers to leave. But frank feedback need not be uncivil feedback. My second story is about a woman who practiced civility as a board member. Experienced public company chief executives, when they go on boards, can return it by helping correct some of the gender pay inequities that they find serving on boards. And to me, that's another way of being civil. And that was absolutely the case for Paula Rosput Reynolds. She herself got a very close look at how men and women negotiate differently over pay, because she was CEO of an insurance company called Safeco, and early in her career, she ran AGL Resources, an energy holding company. And she said to me, men are much more inclined to come in and say, I'm unhappy with my pay. She said women almost never said that. And she said, I've had many, many more conversations with men about what they were going to be paid than with women. She said to me she thinks that women are less likely to make demands for more pay because somehow they think it's not being respectful. They don't want to somehow be the squeaky wheel. And in her case, like many of the women I met, she learned how to negotiate on her behalf for her pay because she figured out how to be an effective negotiator. Indeed, a board member I interviewed at a company where she was a top executive once said to me, it is a hard day's work when you have to negotiate with Paula over her pay. In her case, she played the role of a secret advocate for trying to get executive women paid more while being a board member at 8 different public companies. And she says the issue is that the pay disparity bubbles up when finally these women get a boss who says to a high-ranking woman, I am going to promote you into senior management. The problem is when the women get into senior management, because they've been consistently underpaid for years, their pay is out of whack with their male peers in senior management. For Paula, this issue came to a head a few years ago while she and one other woman served on the compensation committee at a company in the energy business. The committee members like to meet in a room. Their panel met in a room across the hall from the boardroom. At one of those committee meetings, the chief executive told the committee that he was going to elevate a female senior vice president to an executive vice presidency. And he was very proud of the fact that he was going to increase her pay more than 20%. Paula was unimpressed. Even though that gave this woman a $100,000 raise, she pointed out that this woman was now going to still be making less money than all the other executive vice presidents who were all men, of course. In fact, the gap was about 15%. I know, the CEO replied, but that would be a really big jump for her. Paula did not give up. She pressed further. She said, even with that raise that you've promised this woman, this 20% raise, she's still going to not only earn less than her peers, but she's going to earn less than the target amount that those positions are paid at our competitors. And so Paula says to the CEO, you've got to have a commitment that says over a very short period of time, you get her there, bring her up to par with the men. And she said, you cannot leave her down here if you're satisfied with her work. The chief executive acknowledged that there was this gender pay gap at the top of his company, but he said, I plan to fix it over a longer time horizon. Paula and other members of the compensation committee said, no, you've got to push harder and close that gap faster. The following year, the company significantly increased the executive vice president's pay once again. So now she was finally earning the same as the male executive vice presidents. She is continuing to flourish there, and in turn, that EVP became a great advocate for other women, Paula told me. But Paula, in her practicing of returning it and civility, never informed the woman why it was her pay was brought to parity. So what's that leadership lesson of how we can practice civility as board members in companies' boardrooms? As independent directors, particularly those who have management experience, executive women have a moral obligation to leverage their knowledge and their experience to identify and close that gender pay gap. That pay gap, which, by the way, by the most recent estimate, will not get closed until the year 2059. That may include encouraging women to jump ship to get what it is that they are to be paid. The problem, Paula said to me, is men will threaten to leave and then they get raises to stay. And in her experience, the women just stay. I'm going to pause and take some water while you think about that leadership lesson. Paula, by the way, is someone who I got to meet and did a story about a dozen years ago when I discovered that she and her husband were the only CEOs of major public companies in this country who were married to each other. And I first encountered them at a conference where the guy who was running the conference kind of called them out, and he said, I want you to know that 2 of our CEOs in this meeting today slept with each other last night. And everybody turned around, and he said, meet Paula and Steve Reynolds. My third story is about practicing civility by going the extra mile to oppose sexual harassment in the workplace. It involves a woman named Dorit Byrne, who made sure that sexual harassment would not harm the career prospects for women who worked for her. And she took this action many years before she became a chief executive of a public company. She ultimately ran Charming Shops, which is a women's plus-size retailer. In her case, Dorit was still in her 20s when she became one of the youngest divisional merchandise managers for a company called Bon Marché. It was a department store chain owned by Allied Department Stores in Seattle. By 1980, she was 30 years old, a rising star. She was responsible for the junior division, which was the biggest apparel unit. And at that point, one of her equals, one of her peers, but an older divisional merchandising manager, propositioned and kissed her in his office. The guy was married, as was Dorit. She had a young son. And when this happened, she, by the way, is a very tall woman, so they were eye to eye. She stepped back and declared to him, "Don't you ever do that again." He was very frightened by her antagonism, and he asked her, was she then going to tell their boss about what had just happened, about his sexual advance, which was clearly unwelcome. But this was 1980. And so Dorit said, "No, I'm not. The last thing I want is a scandal and drama." But inwardly, she said to me, "I wanted to kill the guy." They were then supposed to take a business trip together to New York, which she had to go on, but she didn't talk to him the whole time they were in New York. And when they got back to the office, she made sure she was never in a room with him alone, and in fact, tried to not go to meetings with him. But she said to me, I was disappointed in myself that this uncivil behavior was not one she could cope with. I couldn't figure out a way to get back at him because he had a different business unit than I did. It wasn't like I had any control over his budget, and I couldn't drag all his merchandise off the floor, although I think the idea had occurred to him. And she said, I also could not fire all his sales associates, and I'm sure that idea crossed her mind too. But she got justice 11 years later and practiced civility to a degree that was not required. So the year is now 1991, and she helped some of her harassed female subordinates at Sears Roebuck to get justice. What was then, and is now, as we all know, a shadow of its former retail giant self, they had hired her 4 years earlier as the very first female national merchandise manager overseeing women's apparel. One day, two 20-something assistant buyers came to her office in the Sears Tower in Chicago. They were very upset over some tasteless comments that one of Dorit's veteran male executives had made in a meeting. Seated in front of her desk, both of these young women started to cry. Dorit said, I stood up and I came around the desk and I said, what is going on? Well, they explained, this executive made these crude remarks while he and these two young women were in a meeting talking about the underwear business. And he said to these two young women, so are these the panties that you wear? I would really love to see you in those panties. She ordered the man to her office. He was shocked when she accused him of sexually harassing these two young women. Please believe me, he said, his voice breaking, leaning forward on her desk with his arms spread wide. I didn't want to offend. I was just making a joke. I was being funny. Dorit was not willing to overlook what had happened. She told me it would compromise me. I had already made it very clear as a leader where I set my boundaries. At that time, the Sears policy was to ban offensive sexual conduct in the workplace. But Dorit was setting a stricter standard, enforcing a level of civility that was not required by corporate rules. And she had already told her employees that she would not tolerate sexist or belittling remarks. She fired the man the same day. At 5 o'clock, she invited those two young, frightened, tearful women back to her office, and she informed them that she had dismissed this executive. She remembered they were thrilled. They couldn't believe that I would follow through with his termination because they knew he was a very capable executive. And they also knew that Sears was a very big company with a lot of people in senior management who were almost all guys. They thought that he would be protected, and because they knew that that happens a lot. And unfortunately, as we fast forward to today, we all are totally aware of the fact that sexual harassment remains a rampant fact of life in the U.S. workplace. We've seen that in that tsunami of recent scandals. It has toppled high-level and powerful men in media, in entertainment, in sports, in politics. A day doesn't go by when there's not another story about someone else's career hitting the dust. And yet, we seem to have not been aware of how widespread this problem is. A survey that was released last year conducted by Red Book magazine reported that 4 out of 5 women say they've been sexually harassed at work. And many of those women say they have quit or got fired due to that harassment. And yet, the fear remains, the same fear that kept Dorit quiet decades ago. In that same 2017 survey, only 10% of those women said that they've ever reported sexual harassment to a supervisor. I can only hope, and I'm someone who believes in looking at life as the glass half full, that the Me Too movement will increase that 10% figure. So the leadership lesson about practicing civility when it comes to sexual harassment in the workplace is that as leaders, business women have to take on the role model of not only enforcing, but going beyond the standards of civil behavior that are set in stone by their corporate guidelines. It's particularly critical for lower-level women to feel comfortable about approaching and trusting senior female executives. Another woman who experienced sexual harassment in her 20s, who I interviewed for the book, an entrepreneur named Penny Herschel, when I interviewed her, was CEO of a startup and had just run into the same problem again with a 20-something staffer who was being badgered by an important corporate client to go out with her. And she didn't know what to do about it and went to her immediate boss, and her immediate boss said, let's go talk to Penny, the CEO. And Penny took this woman under her wing and said, are you romantically involved with someone? She said, I am. And the young woman said, but I don't know how to say no to this guy because I know this is one of our biggest corporate clients. And Penny said, I want you to go back to this guy and refuse to go out with him and tell him to stop texting you because you're romantically involved with someone else. And if that doesn't work, I am totally willing and able to end the business relationship. It's especially important, however, for women when they are newcomers in a company to feel like they have a place that they can turn to. Because as Dorit put it, the unwritten rules are unclear when you first join a workplace. You have no idea whether that culture will tolerate sexual harassment by men against women, and just because it's written in the policy and everyone has to go through sexual harassment awareness training, you need to have a place where you can find out how it really happens. In summary, every one of us in this room, men and women alike, can return it and return what we've learned about how to be successful in countless ways. I totally believe that paying it forward is part of our moral obligation as human beings. But we also cannot forget the past. The women who are achieving success in our companies today have gotten to their successful levels because they stood on the shoulders of previous trailblazers, many of whom are in my book. So today's young men and women must lend their shoulders to the next generation of women. And in fact, on my last day on the payroll at the Wall Street Journal, I sent an email to everyone on the staff and said exactly this. And I said, as new as you are at the paper, you still have more seniority than the man or the woman who got hired yesterday. And so pay it forward. And I believe, to the extent that we all do lend their shoulders to that next generation, then it will be less common for a woman or women to ever again experience incivility in the workplace, and especially not from other women. Thank you.
Some questions?
Yes, can we?
And so Ms. Lublin would be delighted to take some questions.
And I think we also will have a book signing afterwards.
Exactly, we have books. Many of you got them on the way in, but we have books for you there. So the floor is open for questions. And we have a microphone for you. Yes, ma'am.
I mean, I'm retired, and I'm probably like your generation, and like I was an accountant, and we only had 2 people that were women. And now I'm very pleased to see 2 of the 4 largest accounting firms have women.
As CEOs.
Yeah, unbelievable. But I'm very concerned on the board of directors of all these companies. There's hardly any women on them. And I shouldn't say this, but when I get the proxy in the mail, I don't really read the thing, but I only vote for the women, and I go X to all the men. Maybe it will do some good, but there really aren't hardly any women board of directors, even on that Johnson & Johnson, so.
Yeah.
That's all I have to
and
say.
I've written about corporate governance issues for almost 30 years, and about a year or so ago in December 2016, I did a story about who are the biggest public companies that not only do not have women on their boards, but have had no women on their boards for at least 10 years. So I commissioned an analysis by a research firm, and they looked at the 1,500 biggest companies, and there were 76 such companies. And I wrote a story about them. A lot of them were companies who were in B2B, so they were dealing not with you and me in the consumer goods area, but some of them were. One of those companies is a company called Skechers. Maybe some of you are wearing shoes from Skechers. So fast forward about 6 weeks later, my husband and I were in Key West, and I needed a new pair of sandals. And so I bought a pair of sandals, came back to the hotel, and I looked at the box. OMG, they were Skechers sandals. And I said, not only do we need to only vote for the women who are standing for re-election on boards, but we need to vote with our wallets. If you don't like how few women are on a board, or the board of a company you've invested in has no women at all, don't buy their products, right? So of course I went back to the shoe store in Key West the next day, and I handed my shoes to this woman behind the counter, told her my very passionate tale about why I was returning them. And she said, well, do you want credit on your credit card or cash? So obviously I didn't win any supporters on that venture. But I felt a lot better to not walk around wearing Skechers. And by the way, I did a story shortly before I retired about the fact that the New York State Public Pension Fund was going to oppose the reelection of every board member up for re-election at any company in which they own shares where there were no women on the board. And so I had the research firm update that list of the 76, and there were still more than 40 such companies without a woman on the board now for almost 12 years. And yes, Skechers is still one of them. So ladies and gentlemen, there are many other brands of running shoes you can buy.
Thank you.
I'm sorry if anybody here in the audience works for Skechers. Another question.
I have one. You interviewed 52 executives. Did you interview them in their offices, off-site? What was that like? And can you share anything about your perception of their spaces?
Right.
Were they definitive, their offices, whatever it was like, the physical surroundings?
So overwhelmingly, I interviewed these women in person, and overwhelmingly, they were at their corporate headquarters, sometimes in their offices, sometimes not. And so when I interviewed Ginny Rometty, the CEO of IBM, it was very interesting because it was in a corporate dining room, which was literally steps away from this hall of heroes, i.e., huge portraits of every single guy who's ever been CEO of IBM, and then Ginny. So it was very exciting. And then, of course, they said I would have an hour, and at 45 minutes, she jumped up and ran out of the room. But, that happens. I said, okay, totally understand, though, she has to catch a plane. Could I at least see her office? because I really wanted to understand these women's workspace. And in fact, about a half a dozen of the women invited me to their homes for the interview. And the PR guy said, we'll have to, check that out. Why don't you go, tour the headquarters with my colleague here. So the woman takes me downstairs and shows me the picture of the very first woman vice president of IBM who got the job right after World War II ended. But this was interesting, but that's not what I was there to do. And then her boss calls and says, no, we're sorry, it's a security issue. We can't let you into her office, even though she's not in the building. So fast forward, I then interview Meg Whitman, who at that point is CEO of Hewlett Packard. Same deal. The interview takes place in a corporate conference room. We have lunch. The interview goes well, but she then jumps up and has to catch a plane because she's going skiing for the weekend. And she rushes out of the room, and I say, I've read that Meg Whitman works at a cubicle, because the Journal and other people had reported this. Could I possibly see Meg's cubicle? And there's a little pause for her assorted PR people. And I said, and by the way, when I interviewed her counterpart at IBM, Ginny Rometty, they wouldn't let me near her corner office. And they said, step right this way, Joanne. And it was. It was a much bigger cubicle than I ever had in 47 years being in journalism. But it was a cubicle, and they let me take pictures, and it really gave me a sense of someone who wasn't kind of hung up on status and who really wanted people to believe that she was one of them. What's interesting about her, about Meg Whitman, is that she became the very first female billionaire among high-tech CEOs thanks to her leadership of eBay. And then took $140 million of her hard-earned $1 billion and ran for governor and lost. And I asked her, and you'll read about this in the book, wow, that must have been kind of deflating to the ego to spend, because it was more money than had ever been spent at that point in U.S. history by a self-funded political candidate. And she said, no, it actually made me a better CEO. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, well, I discovered that one of the reasons people didn't vote for me is I was too numbers oriented. She's a techie, what do you expect? And they wanted to hear stories, which of course is what makes my book so exciting, because it's all stories. And so she said, and then when I became CEO of Hewlett Packard, I still gave everybody the numbers, but I put them in the context of a story. And I found that I was able to get accepted faster.
It's a wonderful story.
Another question.
And we, please, sir.
I don't know if you know the answer to this, but why is it taken so long? Like when I was 12 or 13, there was that Women's Liberation Day in 69 or 70, and I basically said to myself, I'm screwed, I better learn how to cook, and because my mother was a good cook. And it's like when I got into the workforce, I went to work on Wall Street, and it was changing then in the 80s, and more women were coming, and you still had the leftover morons from the 50s who didn't think any woman should be in there. But it's like, where is the disconnect? Why is it taking so long? Because you think about what women do, quote unquote, homemakers, and what a woman does if she stays home, takes a career break with the kids. They're the ones who run the PTAs. They're the ones who basically get the kids ready for college and ready for life. And yet in the corporate world, there's this complete disconnect where
That's true.
it doesn't exist. And so do you have any theories or thoughts why?
Well, I think the progress is definitely happening, but it's certainly happening a lot more slowly than I ever imagined it would. I also thought, since my book came out around the time of the last election, that I would be riding on this wave of getting to talk about these high-ranking corporate executive women when we have a woman president. And so my son, who is in state politics in Minnesota, texted me actually the day after the election, and he, of course, was very depressed because he's in the Democratic Party there. But he said, you know, this is going to be really good for your book because women and men are going to have to work all that much harder with the guy we have in the White House to make a difference in the workplace. And I think it has taken longer than we expected for a bunch of reasons. I think one reason is because we haven't put in the structural changes and policies that are actually enforced that make it possible for women to succeed in senior management. I think another issue is until we started to get some women as CEOs, or some women in senior management, there weren't role models for women to look to aspire to. I also think when it comes to the gender pay gap, which I have a pretty powerful chapter about, that women themselves have somewhat of blame to share, because as I talked about in the story about Paula Rosbett Reynolds, women somehow think it's disrespectful to negotiate on their behalf when it comes to pay. But now one of those structural changes that is taking effect is a number of cities and states have outlawed employers for asking about how much money you made in that last job, because that practice perpetuated keeping women in underpaid situations because they could only make X% more than they made before rather than pricing the job. But I also think it's really hard, back to your cooking analogy, to eat our own cooking. So the overarching theme of that chapter about gender pay inequities is if you don't ask, you don't get. And so after my book came out, Money Magazine's online edition reached out to me and asked me to write a freelance article about some of the lessons from that chapter. And so I alerted my publisher that in keeping with the spirit of that chapter, I plan to ask for a freelance fee. And my publisher wrote me back very condescendingly, "You're a first-time author, Joanne. You don't understand how it works. This is free publicity. You don't ask to get paid for your work." And I wrote back and I said, "Sorry, if I don't practice what I preach, I'm kind of a hypocrite." So I said to Money Magazine I would be happy to write this freelance article for money. So by show of hands, how many people think I got paid? Nah, you're all wrong. The editor came back with the exact same comment as the publisher. "You should be grateful. We're giving a free plug to your book. So do you want to do it?" And so that's what you have to weigh when it comes to pay negotiations. What is the upside and what is the downside of holding firm to your position? In my case, I thought, oh, heck, it's the online edition. Nobody's going to read it anyhow, and I could dash this off in about an hour. So, but maybe somebody will read it, and maybe they'll buy my book. So that's what prompted me to do it for no money. Got some more questions? Great. Thank you for coming, but take a book before you leave.
Have one.
Help yourself.
I'm not a business person. I was an educator. So my question to you is, what are universities doing to promote civility, ethics, etc., MBA programs? Is anything being done more now than ever before with those ideas?
I think that's an excellent question. I'm not going to pretend to know answers to things I don't know. And so I have no broad picture in terms of your question, but I do have a few experiences because I have spoken about the book on more than a dozen campuses. And one of the things I've been impressed by at several of those campuses is not only at the MBA level, but at the undergraduate level, some of these schools are making unconscious bias training a requirement for graduation. And I think that's very important because unconscious bias is how we navigate the world. If I didn't know this was a podium, I would basically fall off the stage. And so I became aware of what that was all about for a story I reported for the Wall Street Journal. And so I attended some unconscious bias training that was mandated by a female CEO at a US company. And so I went into that training kind of full of myself. Oh, we're going to just look at a lot of pictures of stereotypes. But I was really surprised by the first exercise. We were given a bunch of resumes and told to rank order who you would interview first if you were the hiring manager. And everyone in the group, to the extent they had a relevant resume, put the resume on top for somebody who had gone to their alma mater. That's unconscious bias.
I think you had a question, ma'am?
Oh, I did. What was
Hi.
the youngest, hello, what was the youngest woman that you interviewed?
Yes.
And how old was she? And what did she do?
Okay. She was 33 when I met her, a woman named Clara Shee. And again, through writing about corporate governance, she was someone I had come to know because I was asked to do a story about board members under 40 years old, and she had gone on the Starbucks board when she was 29. And she was amazing. I have to tell you, you don't get on the boards of major U.S. companies at 29 years old unless you have a very powerful sponsor. Back to that story I was talking to you about with Sammy Peterson. In her case, Clara Shee's sponsor was Sheryl Sandberg. Doesn't hurt to have Sheryl Sandberg in your camp. But in Clara's case, she is an entrepreneur, and she co-founded her high-tech company when she was 27. And when I met her, she was 9 months pregnant with her first child, running a startup called Hearsay Social. She was the CEO. And of course, my first question to her was, so, what's the maternity leave policy here? She had 400 or so employees. Funny you should ask, Joanne. We didn't have one, but then I got pregnant. And now we do. 4 months paid leave. And of course, my next question was, since she was due in 2 weeks, this is your baby, this company. You started it with your co-founder. Do you really think you'll be able to stay home for 4 months? She's like, I don't know. Well, that was a Friday, and the following Tuesday, she gave birth to her son and came back 3 months later, so more power to her. She is still, by the way, on the Starbucks board today, and to the extent that you can order your drinks through your phone is because she brought up that idea at a board meeting, and then she had to sort of teach some of the board members how to use their iPhone. Yes and no. Harvard Business School did a study of their recent alums a few years ago, and they actually found that the millennial men had very traditional attitudes about whose career should take precedence to the extent they were going to get married, and it was no different than men and women, in fact it was worse in some cases, who had graduated years before. But all this gets back to education and heightened awareness about not only that women obviously should get every opportunity that men get, but that it's not a zero-sum game. That to the extent that women move ahead in corporate America, men do not have to be left by the wayside. There have been many studies, and I'm sure many of you in the room have heard or read about them, showing that the extent to which there are more women in senior management and more women on boards, the shareholders do better. The company makes more money and the share price does better. Yeah. Take the mic, please. Thank you.
How does one get on a board?
Excellent question. And it's not an easy task. And among other things, you have to understand the process that's involved, because being recruited and being accepted on a board is very different than being hired for a job. You have to design a totally different biography. But the good news is there are many startups out there that run boot camps for women who want to become board members. Equally significant, there are search firms that will charge companies a lot of money to go find high potential women, and in some cases men, their first corporate board seat. But it's still very difficult. One of the last corporate governance features I wrote for the Journal was about high achieving executive women who still were not able to get their first corporate board seat, mostly because they weren't correctly networked with the men who ended up making the key decisions. But several of the women in that story who were coming from unconventional backgrounds, they were the head of HR, got that first board seat because their CEO came to them and said, for your own professional development, you need to get on a corporate board and I'm going to help you make it happen. And so they're, and overwhelmingly, at least in the examples I cited in the story, their male CEO became their door opener and the person who was going to vouch for them. And that's what a sponsor does. A sponsor is the person who's willing to put their professional reputation on the line on your behalf and say, Michael is someone I have worked with, I respect, we're speaking about my husband, of course, and whose reputation I'm willing to vouch for. And that's going to get women's foot in the door. But again, I have a chapter in the book called Beating Board Bias, and it talks at great length about what Denise Morrison, who's now the CEO of Campbell Soup, had to go through to get on her first corporate board.
So a question?
Let's get a mic.
Go ahead.
Hi, Joanne. In the interviews that you did or conducted, was there anything that the female leaders shared with you as far as the programs or initiatives that they implemented in the workplace to help grow the female talent?
Well, I think of all the women I interviewed, the one that I felt had it right was the woman I talked about in my speech, which is Sammy Peterson. Because I think at the end of the day, you can have all the formal programs you want, whether it's workplace hour flexibility or paid paternity leave. There has to be accountability and there has to be a link to compensation. And so when she comes in as the highest ranking woman at Johnson & Johnson, she tells every man and woman on her team who's her direct report, your performance review is going to depend in part on the extent to which you are identifying high potential women, are sponsoring them, are giving them challenging assignments, are exposing them to experiences that will make them well-rounded managers and potential future leaders of this company. And so if at the end of the day you're not held accountable for doing this, it's not going to, all the great policies in the world are not going to amount to anything. Because you know what? Money talks.
I think we have time for one more question because we also want to allow for some book signing. So,
Hello, I'm just curious,
Yes.
what surprised you the most from the 52 interviews?
Well, you're going to find this very amusing, but what surprised me the most was that more than a dozen of these women were at least 5'7" tall. And after a while, I started keeping track of this. I would ask them, how tall are you? And some of them would say, before or after I started shrinking. And having just been to my doctor this week, I can tell you I am definitely shrinking. And I'd say, before you started shrinking. The average height of the American adult woman in our country is 5'4". And in fact, a study was done many years ago looking at the average height of male CEOs and comparing that to the average height of men in America. But nobody has ever done the study that I did on a very small sample basis. But one of these women who was 5'7" would wear 3-inch heels, okay? And when I interviewed her for the book, I was like, you're already taller than me. Why'd you have to wear 3-inch heels? She said, Joanne, when I was put on the senior management team at a high-tech company, I was the only woman on the senior management team. And I decided that I needed to be able to look those guys in the eye. Same thing with Dorit Byrne. She's very tall, wears heels, and when that guy propositioned and kissed her, they were eyeball to eyeball. And I think he was somewhat intimidated by her. The tallest woman I interviewed was CEO at that time of Popeyes, 6 foot in her bare feet, and she wore heels too. And when I met her, I said, "Nice to meet you. Could we sit down for the interview?"
That's a wonderful, lighthearted, but accurate way to end. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
I encourage you to bring your book up for.
I'll go back
actually, we'll go to the table and pick up your book. Thank you so much for coming tonight on behalf of the library and our sponsors, the Dylan Steiner Group and Hearst Media.